Recording. Yeah, it's recording.
This meeting is being recorded.
Got it.
Cool. Got it.
All right. Hey, Donnie.
Hi.
So this is Donnie. He's an expert of in addictions medicine. He's worked in you worked at Banyan for a while, right? Give us your resume, Donnie.
Yeah. All right. I started in the field in 2017. I guess as a fully certified alcohol and drug counselor. I started in a Suboxone clinic called Soft Landings that is now called Symmetria. So I got some experience with the harm reduction. Wasn't really for me, not that I'm against it. So then I left and went to Banyan, which is a treatment center in Naperville that does PHP and IOP programs. Worked there at IOP for 3 or 4 years, then worked PHP for a year, then came here.
What do those words mean?
PHP is partial hospitalization program. It essentially means it's a day program.
Someone to go there from
usually,
like 9 to 5 days a week.
Yeah, usually it's about 6 hours of treatment, right? IOP is a less intensive form of treatment that usually is it's about 3 hours a day, between 3 and 5 days a week. So often the progression of the addiction treatment is someone will either go to, if needed, they'll go to a detox, which is more of a medical thing. And then based on the severity of their problem.
Why would they need to do that? Why would they need to do like a medical detox? Why can't they just quit and be fine?
Well, if you have a physical dependency on any drug, it's very uncomfortable when you get off it, but certain drugs you get sick, right? Opiates, things like heroin, Percocet, opiate painkillers, right? You get very sick.
Like describe that. I don't think a lot of people understand what that's like.
So opiate withdrawals.
I've seen people shit blood.
Yes, opiate withdrawals are not fun. They're like the worst flu you ever had times 100, right? Or the worst hangover you ever had times 100. And the mental part is probably the worst because you are sitting there suffering. You can't sleep. Your whole body hurts, cold sweats, a lot of GI issues. You got water coming out of every hole. And the whole time I can make this go away, right? So the mental part, as bad as the physical, is pretty tough.
All I need to do is take some heroin again or take a painkiller, and I won't feel this anymore.
Right, and that's opiates. Opiates are
real quick.
Why does
that happen with opioids? I don't understand that. I mean, that's one thing I've literally never understood. Why does that happen with that? Like, what's the actual neurochemical thing that's going on there that causes all that?
So essentially your body has a natural opiate system in your brain, right? It produces itself on its own. Like exercise releases endorphins that somehow stimulate the opioid system, makes you feel good, essentially. When you're doing opiates every day, you kind of completely overpower it. You get tolerant and your body develops a dependency, right? So it essentially becomes needed to function, right? When you take that away, right? If you're flooding the natural opiate system with 1,000 times the natural chemical, right? Your body develops a dependency on it, right? Where that, if you talk to long-term opiate addicts, they'll say when they use, they don't even get high anymore. It's just maintenance, meaning that's how they just, when they use, they just feel normal, right?
So they do it basically to not feel like crap.
Right. Now most people, it's not instant, right? Most people do it because it feels good at the beginning.
Sure.
But over time, you kind of lose that. There's a term, they call it chasing the dragon, right? Where you're chasing that initial feeling, the thing that was so good, I've heard it described as orgasmic, that, you're always chasing that, right? And by the end, it's not as satisfying, yet people still do it. That's the mental part of this. It's the obsessive part of this. But
I know that. One of the types of addictions that I kind of see is, I don't handle a lot of drug dependence, but I do handle a lot of what they call like process or cyclical addictions, like gambling, sex, that kind of a thing.
Mm-hmm.
That's the mental part you're saying that exists there too. With like opioids or other drugs, you have your body actually chemistry changes but then your brain psychologically sort of recognizes that this thing makes me feel good, even though you didn't necessarily, even though you don't feel as good as you did when you first used it, you still have this sort of pattern, this habit that you just keep doing it.
What I've noticed is that somewhere along the line, when you have these obsessive compulsive problems, whether it's an addiction to drugs or some other behavior, is essentially you kind of subconsciously, the only way you know how to deal with any discomfort is this behavior, right? If you do it long enough, if you start early enough, you don't really learn in the first place. Teenagers, a lot of teenagers I see, they don't know how to deal with emotion, right? And that's kind of typical of any teenager, but when you throw in an addiction, they become solely dependent on it psychologically, right?
Which is why a lot of addicts form their addiction early in like adolescence, mid-adolescence, that kind of a thing. I mean, anyone can become addicted maybe at any time in their life, but you're much greater at risk for that if you're like 16.
Yeah. There's a genetic component to addiction, but in my experience, the vast majority of people that develop an addiction have some underlying emotional issue, whether it's, anxiety, depression, ADHD, something that makes life a little uncomfortable, right? And then they find a drug, and you're 15, you smoke pot, and you're like, holy cow, all this emotional discomfort went away, and I can be in the moment, right? And it seems like a solution to a problem.
Right. So that's why they get hooked on it. So
and
then
it
fast
is
forward,
for a lot of people. If you talk to people in recovery, they'll say it worked for a long time, right?
Well, what about the idea of a gateway drug like pot or something like that? I mean, I have my own opinions on it, but I'm curious about what you think, because I actually think alcohol is the biggest gateway drug. I don't think pot's as big of a gateway drug as people have given it credit for historically. I think weed it's got its own problems. It's not good, but it kind of depends on when and how and what you use. Where alcohol is sort of like this culturally accepted, actually, I believe, much more addictive than marijuana, and disinhibits you, makes you more likely to get involved in other bigger crap. Like, to me, alcohol is a bigger gateway drug. But is that even a thing? Is gateway drug even a real thing?
That's a tough question. I mean, I think to a certain degree, if we're looking at severe addictions, people start somewhere, and because of the cultural acceptance of pot or alcohol or nicotine, whatever, right? You experiment. It's normal. It's a normal teenage activity to experiment, right?
Yeah.
Whatever you're experimenting with, it's just a certain population, for whatever reason, take it to an extreme. To answer your question, I think anything could be a gateway drug. I'm not really sure what that means, but it's just,
I think the idea is like the idea, historically, right? You go to a DARE program. The whole idea of a gateway drug is if you smoke pot with your friends, you'll end up dead from heroin in 10 years.
Right.
Because,
which is ridiculous.
Because you've opened the door to this, and then you're going to try a new thing. And it's like, what was that movie that it was like the faux documentary about the musician that had what's his name? John C. Reilly, I think is his name. Walking Tall.
Yeah, Walking Tall. No, I know.
Not Walking Tall. That's a rock movie.
Walking Hard. Yeah. Walk Hard.
Yes, Walk Hard. Walk Hard. Yeah, that's where he keeps going in it, and he goes in, and they're like, he's like, "What you guys doing?" And they're like, We're smoking some pot. You don't want any of this shit." And he's like, "Well, what does it do?" And he goes, "It makes you feel good." He's like, "Was it addictive?" "It's non-habit forming." And then he ends up and then he smokes pot, and then like by the end of it, he is taking painkillers,
Right. It is important to note that the vast majority of people that experiment with alcohol and drinking grow out of it. They don't become addicts, right? Like I see a lot of parents that, rightfully so, get worried, concerned when their 16 or 17-year-old is caught drinking. And, the reality is teenagers do things like that, right? And most of them don't end up on the street addicted to heroin,
Right.
Certain certain percentage do, but vast majority don't, right? Like growing up myself, drinking was a culture. I grew up in Hinsdale. We drank, right? At a pretty young age, we drank. Almost, of my 30 closest friends from high school, maybe 2 have problems today. Right. But if you would have looked in the basements and watched what was going on, you would have thought everyone there was a was an
Yeah.
alcoholic,
If you
right?
if
But
you say
people grow
gateway
out of
drugs
it.
are a thing, yeah, right.
Yeah.
They grow out. There is something about that. And I think that's because as you get older, your brain kind of goes, do I really want to be hungover tomorrow? I've got to go work and I got to like hang out with my girlfriend and I don't really want to feel this way tomorrow. So I think I'll skip tonight.
Well, that's kind of the definition of addiction is continued use in the face of consequences. Normal people, when they face consequences from things, they stop doing it. People with addiction issues, they just keep going, right?
I read somewhere that the word addiction came from a Latin term back in the Roman era. Effectively, a slave was addicted to the master, meaning that a person who is an addict is a slave to the drug.
Interesting. I had no idea. That's cool.
But is that like experientially true?
Oh
Like
yeah,
you don't have
control. I mean, if you go to a 12-step recovery meeting, which is a peer-based recovery program for
like an
addiction,
AA or
right?
something.
We talk about the freedom of recovery, right? We talk about, being imprisoned by our addiction, right? Meaning we lose control, we lose choice, we do things we don't want to do, right?
I learned something pretty interesting about this. I saw a guy, I don't know, he's like a, I don't know what to call him, corporate coach or kind of inspirational speaker. Most of his stuff is pretty good, but he was talking about AA, and his contention was that AA might free you of the slavery of addiction, but it makes you a slave to the program. And I had an issue with that. I understand what he's going for, but I think he really didn't understand the idea that a person who's a slave to a drug is actually like you are, hate to say it like this, I guess in like AA they tell you, you have to abstain, but the reality is you still have a choice, right? The recognition is that if I choose to drink, I understand my weakness and I will easily become a slave to that again.
Right. I've heard that, right? You're going to be dependent on meetings or whatever, and my response
Right.
to that is addictions 24/7 and meetings an hour, right? And also nobody's overdosing on AA. Nobody's, going to an A meeting and driving away and getting a DUI, right?
Yeah, but there are people that feel like they can't go into a bar or they can't have alcohol in the house or they can't be around anyone who drinks. Like maybe that depends on the individual, but like, do you feel that way about yourself?
No.
You've
in early recovery, when I'm in recovery, in early recovery, I didn't want to be, and I still, I mean, I don't go hang out in bars, but I could be there. I could go eat dinner. I could, I went to my friend's bachelor party, I go to wedding. I do everything, right? The point of recovery is not like just to live this miserable, boring existence. The point of recovery is to be able to have a life, because I wasn't doing any of that at the end of mine. I was just at home, um,
doing the drug.
Yeah, right. Just isolated and alone, and
What about something like Xanax? This is something I'm seeing a lot where it's one of these sort of borderline, it's legal, it's prescribed. A lot of people have anxiety, a lot of kids have anxiety, and they kind of, I view it like you kind of should. I mean, you're learning to deal with these emotional things and you're not well equipped to do so. And you get overwhelmed by homework and failure and this and that, and you feel this intense panic almost. And the only thing that seems to make it better is a drug, because you need that instant reaction because you don't have the coping skills yet to like work it out, right? And so you borrow your mom's Klonopin or Xanax, or you go to a doc and they give you it, or you get it off the street. I mean, that to me is a very dangerous thing. I try to encourage people to stay away from that unless they absolutely need it.
Right. I'm not a psychiatrist, but to my understanding, Xanax works best for panic attacks. Panic attacks are a very specific thing, right? Where
where they can be debilitating, right? Where you're breaking down, crying on the floor, yeah.
Or you go to the hospital because you think you're having a heart attack. To answer your question about benzos, I mean, I'm not a huge fan. I think they should be used as a last resort, right? In my experience, we're in the middle of an opioid epidemic, right? We hear a lot about it. Benzos are just as destructive in my experience, where, it's rightfully that we talk about opiates because they, there's always the chance that you use and you don't come back, right? You die.
Wow.
Benzos have a way of kind of deteriorating your brain. And when I talk about that, I don't mean like I take one every once in a while for panic. I mean addiction, where
Right.
using to the point of intoxication, right? Benzos are dangerous, right? We were talking about withdrawal and medically going in to
Yeah.
get deep.
Yeah. I was about to ask about
There are
that.
two
Benzos is
drugs
one of the
that
ones.
there are two drugs that are very dangerous that you can have seizures, you could die when you withdraw from them. Opiates is not one of them. It's benzos and alcohol. Why that is, there's a lot of neuroscience to it. I don't really essentially coming off of it can trigger these things where
Well, I know that medically what can happen with either one of those is strokes and seizures due to hypertension. So it's like your brain and body. I don't know why it is that way for alcohol, other than alcohol does a lot of little things, and if you do it enough, it can do all sorts of stuff. But my understanding with Xanax is it's like your brain hasn't functioned in stress for however long, and so it doesn't even take that long. It could be 6 months of use, and then all of a sudden, you anytime you experience stress, your adrenaline starts to pump, and you increase heart rate and all that. And with Xanax, you experience it in such an immense amount of stress that it actually is hypertensive. And
really,
that's my understanding. I'm not a neuroscientist or a doctor either, but I
yeah,
do know that hypertension is the risk medically. But why that's the risk, I'm not
right.
sure.
I I know I've seen, people have heart problems, stuff like that, I think it has something to do with your GABA receptors, which is involved with
Yeah,
anxiety.
because Xanax
I
Xanax blows all that off. I know that.
Yeah,
For
yeah.
those watching this video, GABA is an acronym for something butyric acid. I can't remember the full thing, but what it does, I've actually researched this. I don't know if you have, Donny, but what it does is GABA is like the light switch in your brain. It turns everything off. Like you have dopamine, you have a type of adrenaline called norepinephrine, you have serotonin, you have a bunch of others.
Hmm.
When GABA is activated in smaller doses, it happens naturally, and it causes your brain to like turn the lights off. It shuts it off. And Xanax does like 1,000 times what is normal, and that's why
Right.
people, when they take a lot of Xanax, they'll black out. They'll still run around and do things, just not remember any of it. Their brain
Right.
was maybe
And
active, but they're
often,
not.
I don't know if you've noticed this, when people are blackout on Xanax, they have a weird rage. They do really
Yes,
crazy stuff like fight cops and, you
yes.
know, it's dangerous. That drug, man, for me, working in the field, that scares me as much as anything. As much as anything.
I would say it's up there for me with opioids. Someone comes in and they're drinking too much. Hey, we know how to do that. If they're taking cocaine, that's usually cocaine is dangerous, but it's kind of expensive and it's so short that I don't
Hmm.
see a lot of long-term issues from it. But I would put opioids and benzos up there on par with each other. I'm
Yeah.
with you on that. Yeah.
Especially because these days, if you're getting drugs off the street, meaning not from a pharmacy, you don't know what's in it.
Yeah.
The dealers are
Well, there was a
making their
rapper,
own
Little Peep
pills.
yeah, Little Peep died because he took a Xanax, which is common in that culture, that sort of new age rap culture. Xanax is a really popular drug, and he was getting one that was pill pressed, but it ended up being fentanyl. So he took a
Yep.
he took a ton of fentanyl, didn't even know it, and died.
Yeah. Fentanyl. I mean, it's you hear stories about people putting fentanyl in different pills, in cocaine, in meth. I had a client that overdosed on. He thought he was doing meth, and it ended up being fentanyl. I had another one with cocaine. He ended up, it's fentanyl is a serious
Because it's
problem.
just a white powder, it's hard to tell what exactly it is, and you can't trust the person you're getting it from. They're criminals. They're not. If you're getting it off the street, they're not exactly
And usually the
upstanding
person
citizens.
you're getting it from has, it's
They don't
come
know
from
either.
5 other levels, right?
Yeah.
So they don't know, you know. Um,
So going back to the way a program works, they go to like a detox or something. And is rehab different than that? Like if I go to like a Rosecrance out in Rockford or something for a 30 or 60-day thing, am I being medically monitored for my withdrawal or no?
Depends on the facility. Some have in-house detox,
Medical
some
stuff,
don't. A lot of treatment centers are more outpatient based, so
right?
they'll
So
get a
you
lot of
have to go
people.
through that detox, and then they help you kind of maintain sobriety by
Right.
giving you something to deal with the withdrawal or something like Suboxone.
In an ideal world, the treatment starts when they walk into the detox, right? And
Mm.
once they stabilize, usually between 3 days and a week, um, the clinicians there will make a recommendation. I think you need to go to this level of severity treatment, and it can be residential where you go away. You see this on like celebrity rehab, right? They live in a
Right.
house. It's treatment all day, right? You're self-contained.
Yeah.
A lot of times you don't have access to a phone, and you're kind of cut
Is
off
that
from the world.
is that on purpose? I like, is that intentional because your friendships or the relationships you keep are sort kind of what maintains your addiction? You get what I'm asking? Like, when you go to a detox or a rehab for 30 or 60 days, you're effectively cut off from like everyone. I even think like parents and approved people you get to talk to, it's like pretty short term on the phone. Like,
Yeah,
a lot of times you can't even get visits and stuff. Like, is that part
right.
of the?
I think there's lots of different reasons. Usually people don't go into treatment when everything's great and everything's going peachy, right? Like it's
Right.
usually a lot of outside stress. And even, I've had very supportive families, but they're angry, right? They're
Mhm.
hurt, and
Mhm.
then so being able to get away from that, I think is beneficial, right? Also, if you've worked in the field, you know that like people will go into detox, they'll feel better in 3 days and be like, I'm cured, I'm leaving, right?
Right.
And actually, with you would be surprised how much drug dealing is done via social media, right? It Snapchat, and there's probably other things I'm too old for now, right? But that it's social media is a gateway to a former life, right? Your life, right? And that can be a trigger, can make you want to get high.
So when we're in a detox or a rehab and they kind of block off those relationships, it is sort of to create a vacuum in which you can focus on, I guess, getting out of the addiction until you can think clearly and then make better decisions about what you're going to do going forward.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Sometimes I think there's a little bit of a trend to be more relaxed with that.
Hmm.
You know, there as we learn more about addiction, and counseling in general changes. I think there's been a little bit less. Old school treatment was very like,
Like cut off all your friends,
yeah,
break up
like
with your
almost boot
girlfriend.
camp, right? Like break them
Yeah,
down
yeah,
and build them back up again. It's not quite like that anymore. Although there's so many treatment centers that you'll find one if you want one.
that's true.
Also, if
What about
if
what
you
about
if you do have a
relapse?
loved one going to treatment, try to talk to somebody, a professional that might know the community, because there are some really great treatment centers and there's some not so great treatment centers,
Someone
right?
like you, perhaps? I'm just throwing it out
Perhaps,
there. Shameless
yeah.
plug. Uh,
I have some ideas, right?
you brought up two things that I want clarification on. What about the two things? The two things are predicting relapse. I'm sure with your experience, you probably have a better beat on it. I mean, you could probably tell when someone's like really ready to recover and what relapse would be like and when it will happen and if they're going to. And then the second thing is the idea of a tough love response. You'll hear that a lot from parents or, not even parents, just loved ones in general of an addict, kicking them out or really locking down on things and being the tough love.
Yeah.
Pick whichever topic you want to go on first, but I'm really curious in your opinion what you've seen, what works and what doesn't regarding those things.
All right. Predicting relapse is that's a tough game. If you were trying to make a living on gambling on who relapses or not, it would be pretty stressful. You want to do good, because I've had clients
Yeah.
that I thought have no chance. Like they are not engaged. They know everything, and they end up
Yeah.
somehow making it work. And I've had people that are quote unquote rehab all stars. They're very engaged. They're doing everything told, and they get home and they relapse, right? Which could be discouraging. Generally, though, despite that, the more engagement and buy-in you see from someone, the better their chances are, right?
So is there like a lifestyle change though, or something like that? Because that's one of the things I'm always curious about. It's sort of like how people want to lose weight, but they don't want to not eat donuts. And it's like, well, no, you have to really change how you think and prepare food and everything around it in order to accomplish that goal. And sometimes it might even be a medical thing where there's something going on that requires maybe you have a thyroid issue. And then
Mhm.
my understanding is that that's sort of one of the telltale signs is how committed are they to changing their entire lifestyle. It might not be getting rid of friends. It might be having
Right.
just a more, I don't know, not even disciplined approach, but a more thoughtful approach to life. I wouldn't even call it discipline, but more like purpose driven. Like they wake up every day, they have goals, they're working towards them, and it's
Right.
sort of sobriety comes with it.
I think, well, I mean, from an existential point of view, I think any mental health issue having a purpose is very important. You know, you talk to a lot of people
Right.
that struggle, and it's like, I just feel empty. It's
Yeah.
meaningless. I don't know, right? And when people find meaning and purpose, they do better, right? We talked about AA earlier. I know a lot of people that find purpose in that, helping out people that are struggling, right? I mean,
Yep.
I'm
That's
in the
always been my
field.
understanding. That's like the last step in AA is to sponsor other people, right?
Not quite in that wordage, but yeah, the last step is to help out still struggling alcoholics
Right.
and other people.
And my understanding is doing that is sort of part of the sobriety of the person who's sponsoring. Like it sort of puts that responsibility on them, gives them purpose. So when you do have that temptation, you go to there's a little bit of a thing in the back of your head. I can't do this because it'll hurt others that I'm responsible for.
Absolutely.
Nice. Okay, so that's the relapse thing. What about the tough love thing?
That's such a hard question. It's very easy as a counselor to be like, you got to cut your kid off and never talk, unless they agree to everything. I never do that with a parent because
Yeah, I don't normally do it either.
it's not helpful, right? I will say this in general. An unfortunate part of addiction is generally people aren't willing to do the work to get clean until they have consequences. And some people, unfortunately, a lot of consequences, right? But straddling that line, we call it enabling, right? Enabling means that, subconsciously acting in ways that actually help the person maintain this behavior.
I like that definition, actually.
That's right. Good. Like straddling, but it's very difficult to know what's enabling and what's support, because people need support too, and generally I think it's hard, right? Because you have to trust the person to a certain degree that they're doing what they need to do. You can't work their recovery for them. You can't monitor them 24/7.
It's their recovery, right?
If the plan is I'm going to keep my kid locked in his room for 3 months and then he'll be cured, it's a bad plan. I'll just tell you that right off the bat.
Well, kicking someone out is a common one. What's the downside of doing that?
The downside is you don't know what's going to happen after they leave, right? The potential benefit is the person says, man, I'm not cut out to, be homeless.
I'm not ready to be on my own.
Couch hopping.
Couch hopping isn't very fun. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. And they say, all right, fine. I'll agree to whatever, whether it's go to treatment or go to counseling or whatever. The downside is, sometimes that doesn't work out well. Somebody keeps using and keeps making bad decisions. And
now they're homeless and they're getting further and deeper into it, or they're getting in trouble legally because they're stealing or breaking into houses or whatever.
Yeah.
So it's really tough to tell when you really have to kind of have an idea about what works for your loved one who's addicted before you kind of move on that. And that can be really hard to measure.
Yeah. It's so case by case. Some people would say I'm being too soft and you got to be hard line. And I don't agree with that,
Yeah. I don't fault someone for wanting some form of accountability. You're welcome to live here as long if you take a drug test. If you fail the drug test, these are contingency plans that you have to go through. And if you're unwilling to do those contingency plans, then you can't live here. Like something to that effect, I could see being somewhat reasonable, but because the idea being that, listen, we understand a relapse is going to happen. But we don't enable the relapse. So if you do relapse, you're committing to drug tests, so we know, so you're not lying. B, you're committing to a solution if you do relapse, going into counseling, going into rehab, going into treatment center or something like that, doing something to, fix the problem. I think that assuming a relapse is not a bad strategy, because relapses are, I think, normal as part of recovery, especially early on.
Yeah. I guess the saying is you don't have to, but most people, it takes a few tries, right? And earlier in the recovery, within the first year, I think statistically you're much more likely to have a relapse, right? Because it takes time to address the underlying issues, or just to, stabilize the problems, A kid that is failing on a school, it takes time to get back on track, right? You know, it takes time to repair a marriage and to get out of
Yeah.
debt or to find a new job or to deal with legal problems, like all these things that are associated with, you know, their common consequences, right? So that's very stressful.
And you're dealing with someone who already is having a hard time learning to cope with stress, and they had this easy out so they didn't have to worry about anything. That stuff that the consequences are still there after their use, and so now they have to. Wow, that's a good point. So then they have to deal with all the crap that they did when they were using. It's not like it magically goes away.
We call it wreckage. The wreckage doesn't just disappear when you go to, you know, I'm going to go to Arizona for 30 days and and
everything will be
back,
good.
everything will be better, right? That's not how it works. And, you know, it's a group of people that are, they're used to being able to change how they feel at an instant's notice, right?
Yeah.
And there's a lot of that's attractive, right? It's you know, I don't feel good, I'm going to change how I feel is
and I can
logically
take
it makes sense, right? If you're in the moment like that, but the consequences are often overwhelming. But that's what makes it I think that's what we call it a disease, right? And I'm sure academics could provide a much better reason why it's a disease. In my opinion, the reason it's a disease is it makes otherwise rational human beings, smart individuals act irrationally. And it leads to a change in the way you see the world in a completely at times delusional way, you know. People will say, all right, I'm just going to use once, and they 100% believe it, even though they've said that to themselves 100 times before and never have just used once. But in the moment, you can't talk somebody out of that. They believe it 100%, you know, and that's why I think it's a disease, because it changes
everything,
people's logic and reasoning and all of that, right?
All right. So walking me through this, they go to the detox, maybe they go to a 30-day rehab after that, IOP, PHP, and then after that they do any number of things like see a therapist to address whatever underlying issue, or stay in AA or some other sort of continued treatment. That's typically how it goes.
In a perfect world, right? There's seamless handoffs into less intensive forms of care, and the ultimate goal is back in your life. You know, and we call it relapse prevention planning, right?
Right.
The goal is somebody should have a plan by the time they leave a structured environment like a treatment center or a IOP. They have a plan for, this is how I'm going to maintain my recovery, right? If that's, I go to a certain amount of meetings a week. And let me be clear, you know, I don't think 12-step recovery is the only way to get clean. I really don't. There's many different ways. I think
I was about to ask about like moderation or like California sober, where I no longer do the Xanax, but I do smoke pot on occasionally, that kind of a thing.
And I can't sit here and say that won't work. You know, I tend to be more abstinence, but as I work now, you know, the changing from treatment to individual therapy, I meet people where they're at a lot more, you know.
Yeah.
And it works for some people. Some people are able to. Most of the people I see, it doesn't work, right? And that's a lesson they learn the hard way, sometimes multiple times. But certainly some people are able to do that, you know, especially people who are younger can kind of outgrow it at times when it seems like that they can't, you know. But usually it's a dangerous game to play, right? If I'm an opiate addict and relapse, you know, one of the very dangerous thing about relapse is your tolerance. If you're clean for a period of time, your tolerance goes away. So then if you relapse and you do the same amount that you were doing before, your chance of overdose is much higher, right?
Yeah, your body's
to the point where you have to sign, when you are discharged from a treatment center, you have to sign a waiver essentially that says, I'm aware that this is a dynamic that could happen if I, you know,
I didn't know that. All right, well, let's wrap up. If you could give a recommendation to a loved one of an addict on what they can do to help that addict, what would it be?
I would say more than anything, trust your instincts, right? If you know something's going on, you know something's going on. People with addiction issues are very good at manipulation and hiding and talking you out of it. And if you truly love someone, your natural inclination is to
believe them.
see the best in a person, it's like gaslighting, and that could be that's why people that are loved ones of people with addiction often need to get their own sort of counseling or something, because it's a truly horrifying experience. Trust your instincts, and be there, be open, right? Have solutions ready for when there's some willingness,
when they go through enough consequences that they're willing to actually try, have
Yeah.
something ready to go that you can put them into and get them the help they need.
And just know that people do get better.
Yeah.
Lots of people get better. Lots of people do
Yeah.
get better. It can feel hopeless at times. But people all over the world get better from this disease, right? It's like the most equal access thing. It doesn't matter your background, your race,
Yeah.
your religion. It's like equal opportunity thing. You go to a treatment center and you'll see 18-year-old kids, and you'll see 70-year-olds, and you'll see people of every walk of life. And that's, addiction's been a problem since we discovered like fermented bread or something. I don't know. The Egyptians had alcohol, and
Yeah.
I'm sure there's people that drank too much, so
Probably. They probably did. All right, Donnie, this was great. Thanks, my man.
Cool. Talk to you
We'll do
later,
this
Nick.
again. See you, buddy.
Bye.
Bye.